We're at the Annapolis Maritime Museum located here in Annapolis, Maryland. Our focus at the museum is the oyster packing facility that operated here from about 1918 up into around 1970 it closed. Oyster packing in Annapolis was a huge industry for many years. There were about 17 facilities. Most of them were in the town of Annapolis proper. The McNasby Oyster Company was the only facility on this Eastport Peninsula where we're located. Oystering really goes back even to the Indians. There's plenty of evidence that the local Indians ate oysters, but in the early 1800s, oystering became a growing industry. Up to shortly after the Civil War, it really began to blossom. There were probably thousands of boats at any given time oystering on the Chesapeake Bay, boats from skipjacks like we have here at the pier today, and many smaller boats as well. We're out on the front pier of the packing plant, and this pier, boats would come in loaded with oysters, a variety of different kinds of boats, large and small. And there would be a crew of men here, including Mr. McNasby himself. And they would make a transaction out here on the pier where he would purchase oysters from the boat. They purchased them by the bushel, so he would have a going rate for a bushel of oysters, and the watermen would sell their oysters to him. The oysters then would be offloaded with a simple crane, offloaded from the boats into wheelbarrows that were wheeled in on the pier here into the main room of the packing facility. That typically is taking place late in the day as well. This transaction, the waterman's out very early in the morning, typically before sunrise, and they're working to mid-afternoon and then arrive here probably after 2 p.m. and make their transaction then. Well, this is the shucking room, and the shucking room opened about 4 a.m. There would be typically about 35 shuckers that worked in here, and they would work from very early in the morning, 4 o'clock in the morning, till mid-afternoon. And they spent their day standing in these wooden stalls, which got them up off the cold, wet concrete floor. And they would spend their day shucking oysters. And they shucked oysters just like you and I do at home with an oyster knife. And they would insert the blade and open the shell and remove the oyster from the shell. The oyster itself would go into these gallon buckets, the shells then down onto the floor. This was considered a blue-collar job. It was long, hard, tough days, a lot of standing and a lot of repetitive motion. So I would imagine it was a pretty tough way to make a living. Some interviews with people that actually worked here, they always have very positive comments about Mr. McNasby and how he treated people who worked here, but a shucker who could shuck 10 to 12 oysters a minute and fill many gallons, maybe 50 to 75 gallons a week, perhaps more. Back in the 60s, we understood that they were making maybe as much as $75 a week, so that was very good money. Now that's not year-round, that's very seasonal, and that's a lot of long days of hard work, I'm sure. The oysters from the Annapolis area and other towns on the Chesapeake Bay really were shipped all over the eastern United States. There were a lot of rail lines, and obviously there are big markets north of here: Baltimore, Philadelphia, New York, Boston, and so the Chesapeake Bay oyster was a prized oyster for its flavor, low salinity, and was highly sought after. In the Annapolis area, McNasby's was probably a pretty typically sized facility. There were as many as 17 facilities like this in the Annapolis area at one time. Annapolis is a pretty small town, so you can imagine that was a dominant industry here in Annapolis. Now, other areas of the bay, there are much larger and massive oyster shucking facilities. Tillman's Island had a very large facility, and throughout the bay there are other very large facilities as well. Mr. McNasby passed away around 1970 and willed the company, and the new owners tried to operate here for a few years, but commercial oystering was pretty much finished. They were unable to make a go of it, so in the mid-70s this facility was pretty much shuttered, and the Annapolis Maritime Museum came in the late 90s. The facility had pretty much been boarded up. It had been used by a seafood co-op for a short time, but a lot of the equipment and so forth was still left in the building. We opened the museum, and then in 2003, Hurricane Isabel pretty much destroyed this building and the museum. The museum closed for 5 years in a rebuilding program, and what you see now is the result of that 5-year program. Well, when people come and visit the Annapolis Maritime Museum, we're sharing a piece of history of the Chesapeake Bay, which people who live in the area or from all points around the world don't really have any knowledge of, and it's a very fascinating history of business and commerce and boat building and so forth.